George, thank you very much for joining us today. How are things in Washington?
Oh, it's not spring yet, I have to tell you. It was 31 degrees this morning. I'm glad I didn't put some of the plants out last night. We were supposed to have spring last week. The cherry trees were going, but no, we've got the cold weather coming from you guys up in the Northland.
George, Washington is also home to one of the greatest hockey teams in the NHL, the Washington Capitals, and it also has one of the greatest hockey players of all time in Alexander Ovechkin. They won the cup in 2018. Are you a Caps fan?
I am not a Caps fan. I'm a Flyers fan, but if the Flyers aren't playing or if they're not in the playoffs, I'll follow the Caps because I like Ovechkin. I mean, he's such an energetic player, and I guess he's 38 years old, but he just scored 20 goals again for I don't know, the 900th season in a row or whatever it is. So, it's a pleasure to see one of the real greats in person.
Yeah, he brings a lot of passion to the game. I want to discuss China's relationship with Taiwan now. China dominates so many industries, but the one industry they don't dominate is the fabrication of semiconductors. And many people might not realize this, but Taiwan Semiconductor, which is based in Taiwan but trades on the New York Stock Exchange, manufactures 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors. And many companies are dependent on Taiwan and Taiwan Semiconductor for its chips, including Apple, Nvidia, Intel, AMD, General Motors, Ford, and so many other companies. Maybe you can just explain for us how significant Taiwan is in the making of chips and how they gained this advantage.
Well, the chip industry began with a model that sort of makes sense, to most people, which is that companies like Intel, one of the leaders here, but there were many others back in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s that were the foundation of the industry, where the company designed a product and then manufactured the product and sold the product. They did all of that. Then starting in the late 80s and 90s, the industry, I will say, discovered a new business model and embraced it as a strategic move where they divided those two functions. The design side, people that were really good, they focused on designing advanced chips, and the manufacturing, or as it's called, the fabrication side, where the companies on that side, they would say, we'll take your designs and manufacture them. We'll fabricate your chips for you. We're not a designer, we're a foundry. That's the term that's applied to that segment. And that divide in the industry was a very successful strategic move because it allowed the chip designers to really get rid of all the heavy investment that you need to make to be in the fabrication business. And so the chip designers, and we're talking today about Nvidia. Nvidia does not make anything. They're a designer. They don't manufacture anything. They design chips and send them to TSMC in Taiwan to be fabricated. Qualcomm is a chip designer. AMD is a chip designer. The industry has really divided into those two halves, and the chip design side is dominated by the American companies. It's where all the high value is. From a big picture strategic standpoint, it makes all the sense in the world. But meanwhile, on the foundry side, because it's such a capital intensive business, it has tended to concentrate. And today, we're in a position where at the high end, the most capital intensive, the most sophisticated part of the industry, there's really one supplier, one foundry, and that's Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC. They do 80 or 90%. Samsung probably does the rest of it at the moment. Intel is the only other player in that business. They stumbled a couple of years ago. They may be coming back. That's another story. But those are the only three companies in the world, really, that have the strong foundry capability today. And TSMC is by far the leader. So that means that Nvidia, AMD, Apple, all of them, their source for their product is TSMC in Taiwan. Were anything to happen to that fabrication source, Nvidia they can't sell anything anymore. They don't have a business until they can replace the fabrication somewhere else, which is not something you do overnight. Building these plants now, there's a big initiative of, the Western economies and Japan have realized there's a risk factor associated with the Taiwanese relying on the Taiwan source, given the hostility out of China. And so there's a process of turning in the other direction. And it's going to take a few years. Governments are putting a lot of money behind it. There's a lot of subsidy money, but it's not going to happen overnight. If there were a halt in the supply chain out of Taiwan tomorrow, Nvidia, AMD, they would be, I wouldn't say out of business, but they would be in a deep pause until they could find another way to get their products manufactured.
Fascinating. So when you look at Nvidia, for example, I just want to reiterate this, but they do not produce anything. All they do is design the chips. They send it to Taiwan to be manufactured. Its market cap is currently around $2 trillion. And if China were to invade Taiwan tomorrow and there was an interruption in that business, the share price of Nvidia would just be annihilated.
It would take a big haircut. I don't know how much annihilation you need before you're fatally annihilated, or whether it's just over. But yeah, I mean, not to be facetious, it would be a corporate and an economic disaster if it happened tomorrow and there was no quick way to recover from it. Now, there are hundreds of billions of dollars now being mobilized in the Western world to, in some sense, address this risk and build fabrication facilities in Arizona, in Ohio. Intel is going to spend $100 billion or something like that in the next couple of years in those locations. In Germany, there's going to be another massive investment. In Japan, southern Japan is building like crazy. But all of that capability is going to come online, starting 2, 3, 4 years out. And even as it comes online, TSMC isn't standing still. So they're going to be, the industry has recognized, I think, that they have a single point of failure vulnerability there. And they're beginning to take the steps to move in a direction to mitigate that. But it's going to be an issue for the industry for a long period of time. And how will Red China, to use that phrase, how will the Chinese mainland manipulate that pain point for the West is going to be an interesting question to follow. I personally feel they cannot afford to take any too aggressive an action right now, because they're also dependent on all of that. If Nvidia, well, I'll just say that China is not as strong in the semiconductor industry by a long shot as a lot of people like to portray it, as a looming threat and going to take over the industry and so forth. They've been trying to invest in their semiconductor industry and the fabrication side, design side for years and years without success. And I think because they've done it the wrong way. They've done it the Soviet style, coming down, with mandates, with goals, and instead what they should have been doing was facilitating the growth of their own entrepreneurial sector, high-tech sector, which was starting to grow. And then Xi Jinping came in and slammed the door shut on it, and chased a lot of the entrepreneurs out of their businesses, forced them to sell. Some of them are in jail. Some of them have been, there were famous examples of some of them kidnapped out of the Four Seasons Hotel in Hong Kong and taken out in a stretcher and bound. And now, years later, you discover that they've been tried in secret, and they're in a jail somewhere in China. That they've just gone. The Chinese government has gone exactly in the wrong direction that they should go if they wanted to become competitive in this high-tech space. And so I don't think the good news for us on that is that I think China is not strong enough in semiconductors to actually do anything destructive with respect to Taiwan at the moment. They can rattle the sabers, but I don't think they, I mean, but I say that it would be a huge blunder, but look at all the blunders they've performed already in the last 10 years. So
the fact that
you know,
China has been so unsuccessful in trying to develop this industry, do you think this is why they want to, or why there's a lot of talk about China invading Taiwan? They want to take over this industry, or are there other reasons?
well, the idea that China could invade Taiwan and take over the capability that exists there today and operate it as it currently operates is a fantasy. That is impossible. They don't have the skill set to do it. A lot of it is, I mean, it's not just metal bending. It's an extremely high-tech manufacturing process. It is hand in glove with the Nvidias, the Apples, the AMDs, the Qualcomms. The design team and the manufacturing operation are intimately connected. If China were to do something to capture that capability that TSMC has today, it would break all of those relationships. They'd lose the key people that know how to run that facility. With China's main strategy right now to build up their semiconductor capabilities is to go poach employees from Taiwan and steal as much intellectual property as they can from Taiwan and other Western sources. They don't have the ability to do it on their own. And if they went into Taiwan and tried to take over that operation and run it on their own, it would fall apart. And by the way, this is not just my own sort of personal opinion. This is what has been said by the leadership of TSMC. And you can say they're saying it in part to dissuade anything from happening, but they're also telling the truth. You can't just run an operation like this. I mean, it's like, you and I can go take over, a hospital somewhere, but can we run the surgical operation? We don't have the expertise to do that. The doctors will flee. It's a fantasy. It's a fantasy. Doesn't mean that they won't make a terrible mistake. As I say, they've made so many terrible mistakes in the last 10 years, the COVID shutdown, the destruction of Hong Kong as a financial center. You can't handicap. I mean, who thought Putin was going to go into Ukraine and suffer the incredible damage to his military operation and have NATO expand and all the other things that have happened? Nobody was going to, even according to what I read, 24 hours before it happened, the Ukrainians didn't believe it was going to happen, but it did. So you can't, I guess, discount the black swan event of a completely stupid blunder, but there's no reason to say that it's likely.
Yeah, it's very tough to handicap craziness.
Yeah.
So
Good way to put it.
One of the good things that came out of the whole pandemic was the fact that we in the West, and especially North America, we realized we're beholden to these other countries. I mean, we're totally dependent on Taiwan for the production of these advanced semiconductors. And so many businesses would fail if something were to happen with that business. But we're also beholden on China for the production of electric vehicles and the lithium ion batteries. China produces very little in the way of raw materials, but they control 80 to 90% of the production of lithium ion batteries. So if you're an EV producer, you got to go to China. It's the same thing with Russia and many other services associated with nuclear energy. And they dominate conversion and also enrichment services, and the U.S. is beholden to Russia for those services. But so this is a big positive to come out of this. But once again, you made mention of the fact that companies, Taiwan Semiconductor is building a plant in the U.S. They're spending billions of dollars, but it's going to take 10 or 20 years to catch up with that, or to gain some sort of significant capacity where you're not so reliant, or you don't have such a risk factor associated with another country.
Well, You're right, but I would say, and with the caveat, I'm not an expert in EV or nuclear energy, but standing back from it, I think, yes, if China decided tomorrow that they were going to, I don't know, stop providing materials that are required for batteries in electric vehicles, it would certainly be a significant obstacle for companies here, Tesla and others, that need that technology for their product. But I think the manufacturing sourcing for an alternative source on those kinds of things is more, as I see it, a matter of cost. And yeah, there'll be some delay, and certainly let's assume some cost penalty to replace battery technologies from China today, that you can replace them from Japan, or you can replace them from domestic sources here in North America. But it can be done. It's not technology that is out of our reach. The reverse is not true in the semiconductor arena. That's what I was making the analogy with the hospital, running a hospital surgical center. I mean, the Chinese are not capable of replacing the semiconductor source, and the Western customers aren't capable of replacing it very quickly either, because of the massive capital expenditure required and the long time frames to build those fabrication plants.
No, exactly. And if Taiwan controls 90% of the production, it would take 10 or 20 years to move half of that production over to the US or other US friendly countries.
Well, it'd be interesting to do a thought experiment on the question of how long it would really take if it became a matter of national security and super high priority. One of the moves that I find interesting in the industry is that Intel, which was until a few years ago the clear leader in just about every respect in the semiconductor world. They have new leadership. They have a lot of programs in place that are beginning to look like they're going to have a good shot at climbing back into a leadership position. And one of the things that they've done is they have opened a foundry business. They traditionally did not do that. They made their own chips, and nobody else, AMD or Nvidia, wouldn't go in those days to have their designs manufactured by Intel, because Intel, first of all, Intel didn't offer that service. And secondly, even if they did, there was a sense of conflict of interest between the products of AMD and the products of Intel. So it wasn't there in the business model, but they changed that. They've opened a foundry business, and they're starting to show some pretty interesting initial results. They got a big win from Microsoft for a very advanced what they call advanced node technology, the one that's going to come now be more advanced than what's currently available from TSMC. They just yesterday, the news, or the day before yesterday, the news was that the U.S. government is giving them somewhere like $20 billion of support to build advanced technology, advanced fabrication capabilities. And a lot of that is going to go to the foundry. So if we were on a war footing, so to speak, to replace it, I don't think it would take 10 or 20 years because we have at least one national champion in the space that did have that capability and seems to be on a pathway already to regaining it. But it would take a few years, and it would be a very painful transition for a lot of companies. But I suspect, that right now at all those companies I mentioned, AMD and so on, they are probably evaluating from a diversification, a sourcing standpoint, whether or not they should start to make a move to move some of their production out of the TSMC basket, or at least out of the Taiwanese TSMC basket, maybe into an Arizona TSMC, but move some of that production to an alternative source. So at least they have some diversification to begin to protect themselves in case something happens. And that's a natural move anyway. I mean, you go read 10K reports of any public company. One of the risk factors they are forced to list is dependence on key customers. So there are lots of retail suppliers of retail consumer products that list a dependence on Walmart. That Walmart is 40% of their business. The flip of a switch from that one customer can devastate their potential business. They're forced to list that as a risk factor. Well, I can't say I've read the 10K of Nvidia and the others, but I suspect that they are forced also to list the TSMC risk factor. That I do know, I've seen a study of it, that the number of SEC filings that are now reporting on China-related risk, geopolitical risk, has skyrocketed.
Interesting. So in spite of the fact that President Xi has stated that his lifelong goal is to reunify China, whatever that means, you do not see China invading Taiwan anytime soon.
I don't, but I'm an optimist. So, get the pessimist on here to tell you why it's a disastrous near-term scenario. I'm an optimist, but I think I'm a rational optimist because I don't see any upside for them to do it. I see tremendous downside. I mean, aside from the damage to the semiconductor industry, that kind of move and even ruling out military conflict with the US or with the West, that kind of move would result in massive sanctions that would come down very hard on the Chinese export-driven economy. I mean, China's economy right now, back to our earlier conversation, because they have so overinvested, and the overinvestment is also in steel mills and aluminum and all kinds of other commodities and products, and electric vehicles. I mean, BYD makes more cars than the Chinese domestic market can consume by a lot. They're all driven to now go out to the export world to support that overcapacity. And there's a lot of concern about dumping and what the impact is going to be in a lot of places of suddenly a new flood of Chinese exports that are being driven by this overcapacity that they've invested in. Well, that makes them more vulnerable. The more they're dependent on export to support their economy, the more vulnerable they are to a sanction that cuts them off. I mean, if we put a complete ban on Chinese imports of electric vehicles, would that really bother us an awful lot? Would it bother the Europeans an awful lot? We have plenty of alternative sources. It would cripple the Chinese electric vehicle market. And so I just think there are too many good reasons why the Chinese, for all the bluster, will not undertake something that would provoke those kinds of sanctions, would do the damage to the semiconductor ecosystem, and perhaps have other ramifications. Maybe they were talking about removing their most favored nation status as a trading partner, which would kind of instantly apply a new set of tariffs. So there's so much downside from that move compared to what? A bragging right to say, okay, I unified with Taiwan finally after 70 years. I think I don't see it, but caveat is I'm an optimist, and I don't want to think about the terrible downside scenarios too much.
And I think I would counter that point by saying, from my perspective, he doesn't care about the economy. He doesn't care about money. When I say he, I mean President Xi. But look what they did with Hong Kong. It was one of the preeminent financial centers in the world, and yet they still cracked down on Hong Kong. And now it's no longer the city or the financial center that it used to be.
Well, you're right about that. Hong Kong was, I think, a few years ago, the trajectory, it was on its way to being the #2 financial market in the world, overtaking London. And that's not going to happen now. the scenarios out of Hong Kong are all pointing in a downward direction. And, you know, I guess they'll probably still have, they'll have a role as an access point into the the mainland China market, but the international business that they were hoping to develop is migrating elsewhere. So you're right. I mean, this could be, you know, again, just to counter back on the reasons against, the problem with that the Chinese Communist Party has always, I think, put at the top of their list is to maintain their role, they have to be perceived as being competent managers of the economy today. You know, it's not the days of Mao and global revolution that's going to sustain them. They're in place today, and their power derives from the feeling among the Chinese population that they're good stewards of the economy and they know what they're doing. That facade is cracking already quite a bit. And you know, the downside of these economic scenarios is potentially more instability and threats to the power of the party, which is their preeminent goal. So, you know, I don't know. I'm not a Chinese expert. I know you introduced me as knowing something about the area. I know it only from studying the external data that we see. I just see too many reasons why the political moves that they're going to make with respect to Taiwan in particular are going to be mostly bluster for the time being, at least.
We are hearing a lot about TikTok lately, which is owned by a Chinese company called ByteDance. And during the Trump administration, the president was very vocal about banning TikTok in the US. And it was reported, in fact, that Oracle was going to buy it. And then all of a sudden it just went quiet. And I'm not sure if that's because Trump came to the end of his term or what, but now it's back in the news again. And just so happens it's coinciding with another election year. And do you think this is all political maneuvering for an election, or is there something more to it?
Well, let me first comment on the way I would view TikTok as a company. You know, I alluded to the fact that the entrepreneurial class in China has now is going through a period of repression and a lot of headwinds and obstacles being created by the government and regulation and persecution even of some of the leadership. And I think you have to sort of stand back from that and think, what would you do if you were an entrepreneur with great ideas for a company? Jack Ma would be the one I would start with at Alibaba. You know, he was on his way to building a world-class tech company that was going to stand with Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, the rest of them, I think, and be right on that peer level in many regards. And then the government came in and decapitated that and chased him out of the country. And the whole set of story, I've written a lot of pieces in Forbes about that. Well, you know, the demonstration effect of that on the entrepreneurial class, and then the further examples of it has really cooled, it's put those companies in a very difficult corner where they realize now they have to tread very carefully with respect to their own government. So I'm not sure I'm ready to assume that ByteDance, you know, is or ever was an espionage operation. I think they looked to me like a tech company on the rise, on the make, that would have been like a Facebook or any of. And, you know, if that was where it would have been, again, they could have been, and maybe they will be a player on the peer level with those other social networks. But they're doing it in an environment where they have to kowtow. They have to go along with the mandates of the Chinese Communist Party and the government in Beijing. And that creates the anxiety, I think, in the company about how to play the game. And then they come over in the United States and the US, yeah, we're all worked up about it again. It's an election year. It's a topic that works for both parties. to flog the Chinese today is something that the Republicans can do and get benefit from. It's something that the Democrats can do. It's one of the very few issues that both parties can agree on. And the popular view in China of China in the US has flipped dramatically in the last, well, let's say at least the last 10 years. And I would say it's even more recent than that. We used to have a very positive public view of China, and now it's reversed. It's a very negative public view. So yeah, there's a lot of politics playing to that sentiment base. Everybody is trying to rouse their base, their supporters, and this is an easy way to do it, probably right up there with the border control problems that we have in the southern border. So, where that will settle out in terms of an actual move against TikTok, I do think there will be some requirement for an accommodation. And the question, meaning either a sale of the U.S. branch of the company or some other adjustment to the current model that'll provide security against the possibility of using the ByteDance, using TikTok as a weapon of any sort, an espionage weapon. Whether or not that's a real scenario, I think it's enough of a concern that some accommodation will be required. But then the question becomes, will Beijing allow the accommodation? And right now they're saying they won't. I don't know how that plays out. I think a lot of it is going to depend upon who ends up in the White House, after November 6th or whatever. It's
So
but maybe not.
If the US does move ahead and ban TikTok, what do you think that's going to do to China-US relations, if anything?
Well, it certainly won't help them. It's part of the broad U-turn in the sense of the relationship and the souring of that relationship. It's part of that. It's by no means the dominant part. It's just I would say more of a subsidiary aspect of the thing, because TikTok is, it's not an irreplaceable technology or anything like that. People that can't use TikTok, there are similar offerings now coming from Facebook and others that I'm sure will be able to capitalize on TikTok's absence from the market or difficulties in the market if that takes place. So, and China still I read that TikTok still does 80% of its business in China. And, they've already been banned in India. It didn't cripple them. So that's the one big advantage that China has still and should be able to leverage, is they have a huge domestic market. They can grow an industry like TikTok or electric vehicles entirely on their domestic market if they choose to do it. That was an advantage that the United States had vis-a-vis Europe earlier in history, and to some degree we still have, is that we control a domestic market of hundreds of millions of people. So anyhow, I guess I'm just saying, I think, yes, it would be part of the general souring of the relationship, but I don't think it would be a decisive new aspect of that. It just would be part of the picture.
Well, George, that was a fascinating discussion on China, Taiwan, semiconductors, and also TikTok. And I want to thank you very much for spending time with us today. If someone would like to learn more about you or read your various publications or articles, where can they go?
Well, first, I want to have just a quick closing statement on a fact of interest that I've been following. Today, actually yesterday, the yield curve in the United States was inverted for 623 days running. It's the longest ever. It broke the record yesterday. So 623 days of an inverted yield curve that is supposed to signal a recession. There's no recession in sight. There's something weird going on in the markets, something weird in the bond markets, in the monetary system. maybe that's something we can talk about in the future. But I just want to call attention to that anniversary that we set a record, and it's counting. You know, it's still counting. We're still definitely inverted. And if inverted yield curve is a strange term for your audience, it just is a reference point that has always been used to predict recessions very reliably. And this one is now the biggest, the deepest, the longest, and it is not predicting a recession. It seems to be driven by other factors in the market that would be interesting to unpack. Anyhow, if anyone wants to hear more from me, probably the best place to go is I have a Forbes online column that I write about once a week, try to 4 or 5 times a month. You can Google George Calhoun, my name, and Forbes, and you'll get right to it. And I'm going to publish a couple more today. Well, not one today and a couple more this week. I will touch on the yield curve issue. I will touch on, I'm getting one ready on China's real estate, and we'll see. You know, that may be an April issue. But anyhow, that's where you can find more that I do.
Well, that was a great discussion. And once again, thank you for sharing that stat too about the inverted yield curve. We're going to have a separate discussion on that.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. Peace.